Today in Matthew 23. If you're counting, we're almost to the end. Almost to the end of the book of Matthew. And this is going to be, it's going to be a good end. From here to the end is a lot happens. A lot happens in the Gospel of Matthew from here to the end of the book. So if you want to take some time to find Matthew 23, we're going to read a few of the verses. I'm also going to put them on the screen behind me so you can follow along that way. But I have I have three kids. I have one question for all of the kiddos here. I have one question for you, and I want you to think really carefully about this question and about how you're going to respond. I won't give you dirt, though. Don't worry, okay? That's all right. But I'm not going to give you candy. So listen, it's a lot narrower. Here is my question. Have your parents or your grandparents, Kale's good, ever asked you or told you to do something, made a rule for you that you didn't like? Are there rules that you don't like following? No? Yeah? You like all of the rules? No? Some of them? Now, let me ask you another question. You like all of them? I like all of them. Let me ask you another question. Has your mom or your dad or your grandparents or like an aunt and uncle or maybe a teacher ever told you that you're not allowed to do something and then they go and do it? Like, yeah, you can think of it? Okay, listen, I won't ask for who it was, because Jan's sitting, you're like, I see you there, right? Okay, yeah, okay. I won't ask you what it was, but like maybe it was, don't take your big cup of juice into the family room and drink it on the couch because you're going to spill. And then you walk down and your dad, in our family, it would be me, is sitting and they spill their mug of coffee on that same couch. Has that ever happened in our house? No. All right, it hasn't happened. I want you to think about that for a little bit here as we talk. And I'm going to talk to the big kids and I'm going to talk to the little kids. But I recently was reprimanded by my 3-year-old daughter who keeps bouncing up here and down. I was recently corrected by my 3-year-old daughter, Evelyn. She turned around and she stared straight into my soul. I knew I was in trouble when she pointed her finger at me. And she scolded me. Dad, we don't say hate. She told me that. Because I had said she's right. We've said, that's what we've taught them to be and to say and to not say. We tell them we don't say hate. But the reality of teaching children, be it kids, your own kids or nieces, nephews, at home or at school, on any kind of team, anybody who's ever coached any type of team of any kind, is this. We all learn a whole lot more by what we see other people do than by what we hear people say. Right? That's the reality of how you learn. Kiddos, you learn. Each of us, we all learn. You learn more by what you see mom and dad and your aunt and uncle and your grandparents do than by what they say and tell you to do or to not do. Do as I say, right? Not as I do. We use it as an excuse or as like this justification. And we're like, I realize I don't do what I do, don't act the way I act, but listen to the way I know what you ought to do. So listen to what I say, but just don't pay too much attention to what I do. My favorite positive memory, flip it, from this recent season of life that my family finds ourselves in is the last day of vacation, early in the morning, the 2 older girls and I waking up before the sun, getting some coffee and some hot chocolate and taking Bibles and journals down beside the water so we could read together and we could write. There are days where you feel like you've won, and there are days where you feel like you have lost. And such is the reality of being human. And so I don't think it should surprise us to find out or to see, and I'm going to have to unplug this here for a second, it's stopped working on me, to see Jesus teaching in the same way that he sees and knows human beings to live. Jesus teaches out of his own human experience. Jesus teaches the crowds. And I don't know, Ben, if this is going to work, because it's not working on my side. Completely not working on my side now. That's all right. Jesus teaches the crowds. And he teaches the crowds by speaking about the Pharisees. And we're going to abandon the slides here for a second in my Bible. I'm just going to read straight out of the Bible. And Jesus teaches by presenting 7 woes to the crowd. 7 woes. And they all sound like this. We're not going to read them all. Woe to you. Woe to you who? Hey, does that sound positive? Or does that sound negative? That sounds negative. That sounds negative to me. Jesus speaks these 7 woes to the Pharisees. But Jesus isn't really teaching the Pharisees. He's not speaking to the Pharisees. They've had their day. Jesus has engaged with the Pharisees directly. He's engaged with them privately and in small groups, publicly, in front of others. And now Jesus has kind of shifted his focus in Matthew 23, and he speaks to the crowds. He's rebuking the Pharisees, for sure. He's criticizing them, and it's harsh, and it sounds harsh, but he's not speaking directly to them. They can probably hear what's going on, but he's now addressing others directly. He's speaking in a similar fashion to the way I do at weddings. And if you've ever been around or to weddings, sometimes you'll hear this happen. The minister typically, and I do this, will speak directly to the couple getting married. And they will address them specifically by name. But the hope is that everybody there also hears and also listens and also takes to heart the words that have been prepared. And so they're speaking directly to the couple, but the hope is that the crowds hear and listen. Here Jesus does the opposite. Jesus is speaking to the crowds with the knowledge that the Pharisees will listen, that the Pharisees will hear. But make no mistake, Jesus is speaking for the benefit of the crowds so that they become aware of the burden that was being placed on them in the name of religion. And so I want to begin reading 23 in verse 1. It says this: Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. And that just means that Moses, who had given the law from God to the Israelites, to God's people, had authority, right? Moses' seat is representative of that authority. He communicated the law from God to his people. What Moses said was thought to be binding. And so anyone who sits in Moses' seat today, or at that time, in a way, was also speaking with that same authority. So Jesus says, listen, you must be careful to do everything they tell you. Do what they say. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. Instead, they tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on others' shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Do as they say, but don't do as they do. Everybody knows, and I'm not going to ask you to lift up your hands, because this is a little bit of a harder question. Everybody knows the Christian who does not practice what they preach. Everybody knows someone. Everybody knows, right? Who does not live the way that they expect everybody else to live. Who perhaps memorizes scripture and who tries then also to correct you because they know that you are wrong, but in their eyes, what they do is always perfect, never open to any correction from others in their circles, in their families, in their communities. Forget Christian for a second. Everybody knows someone, religion aside, who, again, regardless of faith, does not practice what they preach. Maybe this is the person at work who is quick to comment on everybody else's performance, but who refuses any feedback or any criticism. I think the reality, too, is every single one of us, at some point or another in our own lives, we know that there are moments where we do not practice what we preach, and your 3-year-old needs to correct you. This, again, is the reality of being human. And if you can't think of a time where you acted hypocritically, chances are you just need to think a little harder or for a little longer. Or at the very least, think a little more honestly. Jesus, I think, knowing the reality of being human, tells the crowd, listen, you must be careful. Careful to do everything they tell you. He's not flipping the tables on the Pharisees at this point. He realizes their authority. He's not trying to start a revolt or a revolution that ousts the current religious leaders and then establishes a new but equally flawed human being run religious authority in the same seat of Moses. He's trying to point out their hypocrisy and say, don't do as they do. Even they don't practice what they preach. They don't do the things they tell others must be done. And to some degree, like I said, that's what it means to be human. But this isn't Jesus reprimanding people for not being perfect. Remember, Jesus is speaking to the crowds, okay, not the Pharisees. This is Jesus reminding the crowds, the people, listen, be careful who you allow to have authority and influence in your life. Because not only will you hear what they say, you will start doing the things that they do. Have you ever had to break up a fight between two kids? Kids, have you ever had a fight with someone that sounds like this? Stop copying me. Yeah? Yes? Yes? Okay? Right on. Yeah, I do that. We do that. That happens in my house. Stop copying me. Listen, in the pursuit of human connection and in the pursuit of meaningful relationships, we naturally become like those around us. It just happens. We adopt mannerisms and qualities of speech and of life habits, even thoughts that are similar to those around us. And it's all in the name of empathy and connection, and that's a great thing. In the pursuit of meaningful human relationships, this is what we do. But it's a great thing as long as we remember that it is, in fact, a thing. See, the Pharisees make religion hard on others. And they make it hard on others without taking on that same burden themselves. They operate with different standards. This is the political leader who imposes restrictions on others and then refuses to follow them himself. It's the individual who publicly supports increased taxes but then evades and manipulates them privately. It's the activist who shouts about environment, but then refuses to make sacrificial changes in their own spending habits behind closed doors. None of these ideals are inherently bad. And in fact, they may be very good. But it's so often the way they are practiced or not practiced that makes them unbelievable. And that's what hypocrisy does. At the end of the day, that's how devastating it can be. Because it takes something that is potentially good and potentially life-giving, not always, but can be, and makes it simply unbelievable. It takes what could be good and life-giving and makes it unbelievable because you don't see it lived out by the people who preach it and teach it. And that, I think, is what Jesus is really concerned about. I love you. I don't think Jesus is concerned about the Pharisees transforming their lives or about religion for the masses being completely overhauled. I think in Jesus' mind, it's pretty clear that that's not what's happening at this point. Instead, Jesus is challenging the crowd. Don't let somebody else's hypocrisy ruin your life and your relationship with God. And I got to tell you, I see this all the time. When people walk away from the church, maybe you've had a friend or a family member, spouse, partner, walked away from the church or away from religion or away from faith. When I see it happen, it's almost always entirely because of the actions and the words of Christians and not the actions and the words of Jesus. See, because contrast the Pharisees, who what? Says, quote, tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders. With Jesus, who says this, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Don't let somebody else's hypocrisy ruin your relationship with God. And don't let your hypocrisy get in the way of somebody else's relationship with God. If we continue reading, if you're following along, I'm reading in verse 5. It says, everything they do, I like the way that this New Living Translation translates this first line. Everything they do is for show. Everything they do is for show. Others, it says, everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries, that is, boxes that contain scripture, either on their head or their arm. They make them wide, and the tassels on their garments long. They love to place the place of honor at banquets and most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi by others. The Pharisees make it hard on others, yeah, absolutely, but then what? They make themselves look good. So not only do they make it hard for others, but they make it easy on themselves. They make it easy for them to look good in front of others. According to William Barclay, who was a Scottish minister and professor at the University of Glasgow, the Talmud, which is Jewish teachings on law and theology, describes 7 different types of Pharisees of themselves, right? 7 different types of Pharisees. 6 of the 7 are bad, according to the Talmud, according to Jewish teaching. And 1 is good. So there was the shoulder Pharisee. This is somebody who's meticulous in observing the law. Everything they do, all their good deeds, everything upon their shoulder, wearing it upon their shoulder, right? Or wearing them on their sleeves. So this is a person who's out for reputation, obeys the law, but in order to be seen by others. And 1. Then there was the wait and see Pharisee. It's the one who would always produce a valid excuse for putting off doing the right thing, putting off doing a good deed. There was one called the bruised and bleeding Pharisee, and so they would not even allow themselves to look at a woman on the street, and so in order to avoid doing that, it says they would close their eyes and then bump into things. And then they would take their bruises and show them as a way of gaining special reputation for great piety, right? Great religious deed. There was a Pharisee who was described as the pestle and mortar Pharisee, or the humpback Pharisee, or the tumbling Pharisee. They were ones who walked with such humility, it says that they would be bent over like a pestle in a mortar, or with a curved or humped back. And then they would drag their feet and trip and fall. Again, in order to be seen, their humility was self-advertising, he says. There was the ever-reckoning or compounding Pharisee. And this kind of person looks constantly at a ledger book, right? Good deeds versus less good deeds, right? Believe that everything they do, every good deed, put God a little further into his debt. Religion was this ledger sheet, reckoning, profit, loss, account, always trying to be on the right side of God. And then, the 6th, there was a timid or fearing Pharisee, one who was terrified of divine punishment, always cleansing on the outside, always trying to do the things that they knew would make them good or avoid judgment. Saw religion in terms of judgment and life in terms of terror-stricken evasion of this judgment. And then lastly, it says there was the God-fearing Pharisee, who was one who would really and truly, out of love for God and for others, delight in obedience to God and the law. You probably aren't dealing with a Pharisee. Can you go sit with Elizabeth? you probably aren't dealing with a Pharisee. You likely aren't worried about the Jewish religious leaders heaping heavy burdens on your head. But I can probably almost guarantee you that you know someone who falls into one of those categories. And that you might even allow others to hold the same place of Pharisee in your own life. Place people in positions of authority who have great influence on you, who do heap up burdens on you, whether you want them or not. People who do good just so that they can be seen by others. People who are quick to tell others what to do but slow to do it themselves. Ones who make sure everyone sees their wounds to see how much they've sacrificed for you. People who are so humble that they can't stop talking about their humility. People who are afraid of God's judgment and who live in terror that they themselves will be judged. And people who take the place of divine judge over others. And I think there's probably a possibility that you might recognize some of these things in your own life too. And I think the encouragement here is simply this: don't be your own Pharisee. Don't heap up heavy, cumbersome loads on yourself. Loads that Jesus doesn't place on you. And don't allow the way you live to become a barrier to somebody else meeting Jesus. I think the challenge of this passage is not just about learning to avoid people who are hypocritical, but it's learning about what is hypocritical inside of me and inside of each of us. It's not just about who you allow into your own life, but it's about honestly looking at your own life and asking yourself where your actions align more with the Pharisees than with Jesus. Again, Jesus says, I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. And then his invitation is, come, walk with me, work with me, watch the way I do it. Eugene Peterson translates that line. He says that we need to learn the unforced rhythms of grace. And that, I think, at the end of the day, is the hope of the gospel